Hello and welcome, viewers. Today we have the distinct honor of hosting Mr. Wamkele, the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Wamkele.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Without further ado, how far have we come in implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area agreements?
Well, we've come a long way. In 3 years, 47 countries have ratified the agreement establishing the AFCFTA, which is quite significant, considering that we started implementation of the AFCFTA in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, when countries were shutting down their borders in 2020. In 2020, 42 African countries were either in a partial or a full lockdown, and yet we were able to make significant progress. Mm-hmm. As you may be aware, trading has started happening under the what we call preferential rules of the AFCFTA. We have an e-tariff book, an electronic tariff book, which enables traders to see what is the applicable tariff or duty for the product that they want to export. We have rules of origin, over 92% rules of origin of all of the products that we trade in Africa. We've converged on 92%. So these are significant milestones that we have achieved under very difficult times caused by COVID-19 pandemic. We have introduced a Pan-African payments and settlement system. We have also started what we call the Guided Trade Initiative, where a number of countries have started trading under the preferences of the AFCFTA. Mm-hmm. So good progress, but much remains to be done.
Much remains to be done. And talking about what needs to be done, what is the game plan for achieving long-term goals of the AFCFTA?
The long-term goals are a sustained increase of intra-Africa trade. So today, intra-Africa trade, the best percentage of it that you will see is that it is 18%. Mm-hmm. We have to, in the immediate term, we want to double intra-Africa trade by 2035. We want to make sure that there's a depth of industrial capacity in Africa to trade in high value added production or manufactured goods. That's how in the long term we will be able to improve intra-Africa trade, to create jobs and innovation on the African continent. We must, as a continent, we must consume what we produce. Mm-hmm. and produce what we consume. So, and that will take a long time. It's a long-term objective, but we have made a very, very good start in establishing the legal foundation that creates a common market, that creates a seamless movement of goods, seamless movement of investment, of capital across the African continent.
So we already have a good start, but we still need to work to achieve our long-term goals.
I think if you look at the legal instruments, the legal foundation that we have established in less than 5 years, mm-hmm. and you compare that with where the European Union was in its own trajectory of integration, you will see and identify commonalities. And the success of the integration project of the European Union suggests to me that we are on the right track, and that we have looked at models of success of integration around the world, and we've incorporated them into what we are doing, and we have crafted an integration model that works for Africa, but that looks at what is international best practice. Mm-hmm.
So why is a unified African economic trade space crucial, especially amid such a globalized world?
Well, a number of reasons. If we look at Africa's contribution to global trade, mm-hmm. about 2%, very, very small. Africa's contribution to global GDP, around 3%. So the combined contribution of Africa to the global economy is relatively small compared to other regions of the world, and indeed, of course, compared to other countries. Yet our continent has over 30% of the world's remaining minerals. So potentially, we are a very rich continent, but we don't see that being translated into our manufacturing capacity, our job creation, our GDP per capita. When you look at all of the indices that do matter in people's lives. So to create a single market, an integrated market, enables us to leverage on this continent of 1.4 billion people, which is a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion United States dollars. So it's about creating scale. So if you think about it, if you are a small, medium enterprise in East Africa, previously, before the AFCFTA, your immediate market was the East African community. If you are in Kenya, it was Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and so on. Now, with the AFCFTA presenting a preferential market, preferential access to the entire market, you now are able to scale from East Africa into West Africa, North Africa, and other parts of the continent. So the value proposition is an incredibly dynamic and scaled market. If you look at what happened with COVID-19, the African continent was, as I always note, at the back of the queue for receiving much needed vaccines. The back of the queue for vaccines, the back of the queue for the germ-killing products that we needed to fight the pandemic. Because of the disruption in the global supply chain, and of course, because some countries imposed export restrictions on what we needed as Africa to fight the pandemic. That should suggest to us that we need to enhance our manufacturing capacity. We have to establish the regional value chains that will create this resilience that we need to fight not just this public health crisis, but also where in future there are disruptions in global supply chains, that we have the supply chain capabilities here on the African continent. And so this is why it's so important to establish an AFCFTA market that creates the right environment for alternative supply chains, which can be here in Africa. And already we see examples. We see examples of this in the pharmaceutical sector, for example, since the end of the COVID pandemic.
Right. Moving to the next question. In numbers, what economic and social impact can we actually expect from this ambitious trade pact?
Well, if you look at the projections of the World Bank projects that by the year 2035, the African Continental Free Trade Area has the potential to lift over 50 million Africans out of abject and moderate poverty, to contribute up to $300 billion to Africa's GDP, to increase Africa's intra-Africa trade by in excess of 50%. All of these are the potential socio-economic impacts, plural impacts of implementation of the AFCFTA. Similarly, the International Monetary Fund is equally optimistic about the AFCFTA and its impact on economic growth in the African continent. And I think what we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, if I can go back to that example again, what we saw was a 35% reduction in Africa's overall exports in 2020 and 2021 because the African continent was overly exposed to the market, the export market in Europe. And so when the export market in Europe shut down, the African continent suffered. So creating a market of our own will enable us to establish the resilience, whether it's export resilience, import resilience, supply chain resilience that we need. I believe that in the long term, that is what the AFCFTA positions us for, both from a socio-economic impact, but also from the impact of competitiveness.
Mm-hmm. Now, moving to, since we talked about the importance of this AFCFTA, the challenges, the impact. So what are the key hurdles slowing down the full implementation of this ambitious project?
There are a number of hurdles and challenges. The first, of course, is the ever-changing global geopolitical context, which has an impact on what we're trying to achieve. The coup d'etats that we have seen in countries in West Africa disrupt trade and shut out traders from markets. From other markets in the region. Macroeconomic imbalances that we see, the currency fluctuations, all of these are, in a sense, externalities. But in the immediate trade area, some of the challenges include institutional capacity of countries that has to improve in order for them to see the advantages of the AFCFTA or ZLECAf, the need for us to accelerate industrial development that will enable trade in value-added production, whether it is in the agro-processing sector or manufacturing. These are challenges that we have to overcome as we implement what you correctly describe as a very ambitious trade agreement.
Right. What do you think about the external interventions? How are these external interventions and attempts of foreign influence, how are they hindering our path towards a united African trade zone?
The attempts at influencing the direction that we are taking as Africans will always be there. And we have to make an assessment of each attempt and assess that attempt on its merits. Some attempts to influence us are positive. Some attempts to influence us are negative. So we've got to make an assessment of what is the trading partner or the development partner or whichever kind of a partner, what are they proposing? But I think what has got to be the guiding principle when we make an assessment of influence is it in the best interests of Africa? Is it in the best interest of Africa's economic development? Is it in the best interest of Africa's boosting intra-Africa trade? I want to give you an example. If country X comes and says to us, we are very much interested in encouraging investment and manufacturing in Africa, in the AFCFTA market, that's a very positive influence. If country X will encourage their investors to establish a commercial presence which would create jobs in the AFCFTA market and create innovation and spur on the economic activity that we want to see, that is a positive influence. And there are those development partners who have approached us with that in mind. But as I said earlier, we have to assess every kind of an attempt to influence us on its own merits.
Understood. Now, African projects, there are a lot of African projects. For example, the Trans-Saharan Highway, the Tindouf-Zouirat Road. How do they boost economic integrity in Africa?
It's a very good question. You know, the fragmentation over the last 60 years is very, very deep. The continent is fragmented in regions and countries. The trade corridors that are in existence and those that will be established have a very instrumental role in connecting the different regions of the African continent. And so, for example, the trade corridor that Algeria is investing in and building, the trade corridor that will connect Algeria with Mauritania, which would then open and grant Algeria access into West Africa, into the West African market in countries south of Senegal. These are very important trade corridor linkages that have a very positive impact and contribution to intra-Africa trade. So we have to invest more in these trade corridors, in transport corridors, to ensure that the connectivity that we want to see facilitates the enhancement of intra-Africa trade.
Right. How does the AFCFTA contribute to addressing security challenges, if we can talk about security challenges, and especially in the Sahel region?
Well, there's no direct instrument that we have. It's a trade agreement. But obviously, the underlying point that you make is absolutely correct. We cannot have trade where there's instability. We cannot have trade where the traders are shut out of markets. We cannot have trade where there is a context of a civil war, for example. So instability has a very negative impact on the AFCFTA, not only in the Sahel, but across the African continent where there is instability. It has a negative impact on the objectives of the AFCFTA. I am deeply worried about the incidence of instability and coup d'etats that we have seen, because if you have a coup d'etat in Niger, and the informal trader in Niger who previously, before the coup d'etat, who had access to the markets in Burkina Faso, in neighboring countries, they now no longer have that market as an export market. They are shut out completely. So informal traders suffer, smallholder farmers suffer as a result of these incidents of either a coup d'etat, instability, or civil war. So this is a matter of deep concern. But as you know, the African Union, the leadership, the Assembly of Heads of States, our heads of states have been very, very clear on this matter, that the African Union is not going to tolerate unconstitutional changes of government, is not going to tolerate acts of terrorism, as we've seen in some instances in the Sahel. You will recall that last year in May, the heads of states convened in Malabo, a special session of the Assembly of Heads of States and Government to deliberate and find solutions to this challenge of instability caused by terrorism or instability caused by unconstitutional changes of power. So as much as the trade instrument, the ZLECAf as a trade instrument is within our control, but there are things that are outside of our control, such as I mentioned, a coup d'etat here, a civil war there. Those are out of our control. Nonetheless, they have a very negative impact on what we're trying to achieve.
Understood. Now, if we want to talk about the recent measures of the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, what do you think about the recent measures, those that are actually, that he has taken to go towards the African continent more?
Well, I think that's very, very commendable, because if you recall, Algeria is a founding member of the Organization of African Unity. And Algeria has always had very, very strong Pan-African credentials. So I'm not surprised that Algeria is investing in this vision of Pan-Africanism, which is really the next step that all countries now must take. We have to go beyond declarations of Pan-Africanism, and that's exactly what Algeria has done. By investing in, on the corridor that connects Algeria to Mauritania, by investing in the airline connectivity, Algeria will now connect with South Africa, with Addis Ababa, Mauritania, Senegal, and the commercial banks that are being opened in a number of African countries. These, to me, are examples of going beyond. They're a very important declaration of Pan-Africanism, but actually giving commercial meaning to that commitment of Pan-Africanism. So it is very commendable what His Excellency the President has done and the government have done and will continue to do, because I believe we will see more of these kinds of commercially meaningful, concrete Pan-African actions.
Yeah. Right. Now, beyond government pledges, government support, how can companies and the private sector drive African economic unity?
We introduced the Guided Trade Initiative, as I mentioned earlier, which started with 8 countries. Next year it will be 31 countries. And this morning, His Excellency, the Minister of Trade, announced that Algeria will be part of the Guided Trade Initiative. The Guided Trade Initiative is private sector. It is small, medium enterprises, it is large corporations in Africa who are seeking to expand to new markets or invest in new markets or import products and services from new markets across the 47 countries that constitute ZLECAf. So private sector is a key driver and a key pillar of implementation of ZLECAf. It is not governments that trade. What governments have to do is to create the enabling environment, which is a very important role that they have to play. But the primary beneficiary and the primary drivers are the private sector.
The private sector. Now, how does the AFCFTA empower African nations both politically and economically?
If, as a continent, if we look down the road to the year 2035, where we've been able to boost intra-Africa trade, particularly in manufactured goods, if we have trade, intra-Africa trade that is close to 50%, that would be a very, very significant demonstration of Africa's economic independence. It would be a very strong indication that the African continent is able to be self-sufficient, and that the African continent, faced with another pandemic or another global disruption of supply chains, that the African continent can provide itself with the solutions to a challenge, if it is in public health, in a crisis, public health crisis, COVID-19, similar kind of crisis, or indeed if there's an economic crisis outside of the African continent, in a market to which we export. All of these externalities that have caused very, very materially severe negative impacts on Africa's economy, we will be able to reduce that negative impact because we have a domestic market. And the domestic market is the AFCFTA market. So creating resilience in supply chain, in manufacturing, in food security, all of these things really depend on us as Africans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wamkele.
Thank you
very much for these insights, for your time, and for joining I24 News. I think our interview has come to an end. Thank you, dear viewers, for following us. Stay tuned for more.